Welcome to the To a Kidney podcast. You're with Mon and Don.
Two advanced practice nurses with decades of experience in hard-to-heal wounds, burrowing into prickly conversations. So welcome back to episode 3 of the To a Kidney wound podcast with Monica and Donna. I wanted to welcome in first by saying thanks for sticking with us, episode 3. I think this is the episode where we really kick off. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to share with you something that's really helped me in my wound practice, also going into private practice, but just in general life. I'm a little bit of a Brené Brown fan, and I was listening to her do a wonderful podcast with a couple of other really good speakers, Adam Grant, Simon Sinek, all those people that you would know. And they were talking about celebrating the first and second pancake, not the third. Everyone wants the first pancake. So we're talking about making pancakes. We're looking for that perfect pancake. And, we're quite new to podcasting.
Yeah.
And I feel as though we're easing into it a little bit now with episode 3. But actually what we probably should be celebrating is having done 1 and 2, because even though they might not be 100% perfect and polished, and we're going to learn a lot as we go along, and it's just very real and raw, and it's prickly, hey, we're talking about echidnas. But getting through episode 1 and 2, that's where the rubbers really hit the road, where we should be celebrating, because that's where the work is done. So if you're doing something in your wound care practice and you're not always getting it right, and we talked about in the last episode how we will reflect on the decisions that we make, and we acknowledge that we always don't get it right. Yes, there's implications for good, safe clinical care. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be aiming for that. However, there's a lot of greyness in wound care, and sometimes we might make a call. It might not necessarily be a clinical call that we think maybe that didn't go the way that I wanted it to. But we're human as well, and we don't get it perfect all the time. But are we celebrating learning, and are we reflecting? I know myself as a wound clinician, I found reflection really hard to do earlier on in my career, but it's absolutely needed in working at an advanced practice level. So, I just wanted to acknowledge we've got to maybe the third pancake.
We have. Yeah. I've never heard of the 3 pancakes. So that really does resonate with me and gives me more confidence, I suppose. I think, even as advanced practice clinicians, we're still making a lot of first pancakes.
We are.
And I think the perception that, the expectations we put on ourselves, but the expectations on others are that we're great at, making our first pancake comes out beautifully. Absolutely. Every single time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. And I think sometimes we think, here we go.
We think,
We think we've made the first pancake. Oh, the first pancake is the best.
Yes.
But in fact, we've got to learn about how to make pancakes 2 and 3.
We do.
And sometimes we as advanced clinicians come in and say, great first pancake, but maybe we can refine it and get it to that third stage.
I like that analogy. What's that when it comes to putting the dressing on? Sometimes when I'm first making pancakes, I'll put 4 in the pan at once. And I'm often telling people, no, we're not going to put in all the fancy dressings now. We're just going to do maybe 2 or 3 changes at that first visit. And they're wanting everything at once because they're really desperate. But you've got to take your time and unpack the bigger issues. And often if we put in place, I would like to go in and put in place 10 or 12 changes all at once, but you just can't. And I'm just making that analogy to pancakes. So,
yeah, look, I think that sort of brings there'll be many times we'll be talking about dressings because we know that's what is often requested of us, even it's often the least thing that we like to talk about. That's honest.
Definitely.
Like when someone comes to me and says, what dressing do I put on that? Or just quickly tell me, I've got this person with, diabetes, unstable diabetes. I don't know what their circulation's like in their legs. They're hypertensive, they've got swelling everywhere. But what dressing do I put on the wound? And I now have learned to say, and again, people at our level have figured out different ways of saying the same thing. But and I say this to people with wounds as well, that if I'm unwell, I don't go to a doctor and say, what tablet do I take?
Correct.
And yet nearly every day I get asked, what dressing do I put on that?
Yep.
And if you think of everything that a doctor or a GP or someone who prescribes, nurse practitioners, podiatrists, the thought processes that have to go behind assessment, taking history, assessing the person, diagnostics, before you finally prescribe that tablet, the same processes we conduct with things such as dressing prescription, and we've talked about it before, compression prescription. And again, it's controversial using that word prescription. We're both not nurse practitioners. We don't prescribe. And so is that the domain of the nurse practitioner? And then that confuses things. But we most certainly, I believe, prescribe dressings and prescribe compression.
Absolutely. And I would border on saying support surfaces.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I do find that word prescription used appropriately in some of the areas I work. I'm often asked to provide that expertise beyond the level of a generalist for, say, a predetermined period of time, like 6 months, what kind of formulary is appropriate. And that can be for I would always liaise with my OT colleague. Often they need to do that, but I'm often in close liaison with them. But so that's for support services, but often for lymphedema-related equipments and therapies and dressings as well. Yeah, do a prescription. I don't find that word's abused terribly.
You don't find it's abused?
No, I don't. Not in the areas I've been. But it's an interesting word. Often it's used by insurers.
Yeah. I think some craft groups find that a bit controversial.
I can see how that would be.
And then the same thing with, when people say to me, I don't think I've mentioned I'm also a lymphedema practitioner. I realised I hadn't mentioned that in episode 1. But when people say to me, we've tried compression. And again, the analogy is, we've tried that tablet.
Yep.
Or, and particularly with people who, say, enjoy cars or have a thing about cars or understand cars, I often will say, not often, but I do say, well, I don't say to you, what tyre do I put on my car? Same as dressings, same as compression. And I think we'll explore that in future.
It's a great topic to explore. I think that's really good. I love the car analogy, I have to say. Sometimes my next question to that is, well, it depends how fast you want to get there. Yes. Or do you want to take the scenic route? Yes. Or do you want to take – which route do you want to take? Because it might depend. Do you want the bumpy ride or do you want the shore ride? And that's okay to make all of those decisions. Yeah.
I really like that one.
Because how do you get from Geelong to Melbourne?
Yeah.
Well, there's one road, but what car might you go in? There's actually other ways to get there as well, and it depends what's right. So I will often use the word goals when I have presented with that question. What dressing should I put on, or can you just put them into compression? I was like, well, there's like an hour and a half assessment to work out what type of compression we're going into. So I really struggle with that. Just go down and put someone into a compression doesn't work, or that dressing doesn't work. Well, have you spent the time to assess why? And have you got the goals? What are you trying to achieve? So,
and getting the best bang for your buck. And it's really hard when there are all these fiscal pressures or these financial pressures on services and therefore clinicians to do max work in the tiniest amount of time. But often that work we see is inefficient. So we may be putting compression on someone, or we may be putting a dressing on someone, and great, we've ticked that box, we've got that dressing on and we've got that compression on, but there's often harm or that occurs as a consequence of that.
Huge amount.
Yeah,
Huge
and then that pressure is then we reflect that pressure, or that pressure is then translated to the person with the wound and their family and their friends, and the expectation is that we come in and we wave the magic wand. And I'm finding often, as you were talking about the car and the journey, I haven't talked much about kidness this podcast, but we'll have to get there.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, whether you're slow like in a kidna or anyway. But often I found myself saying this just recently. Don't think about the destination at the moment. It's important that we know where where you want to land.
Yes.
But we've got to think about the journey or the journeys you've been on, and often they're multiple tangled journeys, but also where did you start? Where was your destination? And that, I suppose, brings us to etiology.
It does. It absolutely does. Because that's what we wanted to focus on for this episode. So we'll get there. Yeah.
So etiology.
Etiology, it's a massive prickly word.
So the beginning. Where does the journey start?
The beginning. I find when I'm often talking to a lot of clinicians, talk about working diagnosis, and we can maybe unpack the word diagnosis a bit. That's prickly in itself. So when you want us to put on compression, when you want us to prescribe a dressing, what are we trying to achieve? What are those factors affecting healing, and how is that related to that type of wound that is there? Is that type of wound the cause or the failure of why it's not healing, or is it just one of the factors that are involved, and how do you work out which is the predominant aetiology, and how does that translate to the interventions that you're going to do? And they're often not dressing-based interventions. Do you go back and revisit your wound aetiology when that wound is not healing?
And there's a prickly point. Is it only one aetiology, or are they contributing equally or triply?
We love to box things up.
We like to call it an arterial wound, a venous wound. That's for another episode.
Absolutely.
But
in clinical practice, are we seeing these things in isolation?
And we silo.
Very
We
rarely.
silo
Yep.
etiologies.
Yep.
What's happening
I
out
also
there?
struggle with the whole moisture lesions that we often find they're all hanging out together, and how do you decide whether that is – there's some good, recommendations and evidence around delineating a pressure injury, say from a diabetic foot ulcer or an ischemic wound, or on the pelvic girdle it might be a moisture lesion or IAD or a pressure injury. But I really feel in clinical practice a lot of these things are overlapping.
Yeah.
And how do we put that line in the sand? Should we even be putting a line in the sand, and doing that box ticking and siloing the treatment up?
And I suppose, what's the relationship of all of those to each other?
Are we expecting too much of some of the generalist clinicians to
Yes.
call? I really feel we are too.
And they put that expectations on themselves that I have to determine the etiology. Often,
right there at that first visit also, that's a lot of pressure.
And we were part of that too, especially in our earlier years.
Yep, there's a lot.
We perpetuated that assumption and those myths.
Because that's what we'll get requested for education.
Yes.
Come and teach us about that. Come and teach us about the stages. And we default to those things, stages, categories, classifications, all of those, for a lot of those type of wounds. But are we really identifying first what type of wound it is? And is that actually a reasonable question? The more experienced I think I get, the more I realise it's probably idealising a lot of
I even think
these wounds. Yeah. What
I'm
type
just getting
what type
excited.
of wound do you have? Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Well, just even things like stage 1 pressure injury. Like, you may get some blanching in that part of where the redness is.
Correct.
And maybe no blanching there.
Correct.
Or some of us push really hard, some of us push really low. And, there's really no understanding. And so what about if it takes a while to blanch?
Have they just been offloaded from that area, or has it been offloaded for 45 minutes or 2 hours? And what surface were they on last night? All of those things.
Yeah. So
we've all got lots of time to spend doing all of those things, and we don't all have that knowledge.
Yeah, and so people expect that sometimes it's really easy. I think actually stage 1 pressure injuries and deep tissue is really quite complex. I think once you can feel bone or palpate bone or fascia, stage 4, if you see something covered completely with eschar or slough and you really don't know what stage it is, that's relatively easy. But I reckon some of those stage 1s, I've just thought of that as I'm talking to you. I've not really...
I would agree with that, and I would say stage 2s as well. I think they're grossly... a lot of things are called stage 2 and they're clearly not by the time I come along, but I rarely see stage 2s. It's a weird little stage for me. It just...
Well, when you look at the standards and you look at the classification points on the stages, the word that separates stage 2 and stage 3 is slough. And so...
but also I would add granulation tissue.
Oh, yeah. Let's maybe park that for another episode,
I think we
staging
need to talk
pressure
about
injury.
Yep.
But that's so I suppose really want the listeners to feel, and here's one of my sayings, feel confident to be unconfident. And the more expert I become, the more confident I am in being unconfident. And look at me now here at this stage, questioning, how difficult it is to stage a stage 1 pressure injury.
You would think a wound consultant with your level,
Yeah.
level of experience would be all over that. And we teach it.
Yeah.
We teach it.
We do. And things like, what is the predominant vascular, which means a few things for another episode, but what is, and there's some teasers, what is the vascular etiology and which one is the predominant? And what assumptions I've been making in my clinical practice previously? And so, the more you know, the less you know. And so when you are
correct,
and so, you get people, coming out of having done formal wound education, and that's great. It's so critical. That goes without saying. But really, that's just the beginning of your wound management. You really need to then start maintaining your curiosity and being confident to be unconfident. Don't assume that what we've learned now, we're going to bring those into subsequent episodes, but hopefully we'll bring some really provocative content into these podcasts in subsequent episodes. So and so I suppose you want to talk about focusing more on the etiology versus what's stopping the wound from healing, and maybe around a skin tear, for example.
Well, there's also, I would add into that, the mechanism of injury versus that predominant etiology too, because how many people have come to you and I, it's a burn, it's a skin tear, and it's 3, 6, 8 months old. It's none of those things that might have been the original mechanism of injury. Clearly there was a traumatic event, but it's not necessarily the reason why it's failing to heal. So then we've got to decide what that etiology or that factor affecting healing really is. So there's that initial stage.
Or it's a skin tear, and that's, again, I'm just already thinking about content. A skin tear that someone has put steri strips on, and then it's a category 2 skin tear, type 2, and they've put steri strips and just stretched it right over. I mean, steri strips already, bing bong, but steri strips, and then stretch that flap right over to make it look beautiful.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so
at what point, what I struggle with, it's a grey area, at what point and this is why I believe it's hard for clinicians, we're almost setting ourselves up for failure. At what point on the wound chart do we change that etiology? So if we've been writing it down as a skin tear, who has got the confidence to come along and say, actually, this is a skin tear no longer?
Yep.
And is that an unreasonable expectation for the generalist clinician who's very well-meaning and doing everything they can, following their organisation's protocols? At what point do we call it? And then often, we'll come in maybe a year later and say, this is all wrong.
Yeah.
What's the reasonable expectation that they would have picked that up? I think sometimes we're asking too difficult questions of them, but those trajectories aren't written really well into our protocols. We're just writing write what type it is.
Trying to put it into a box, trying to put a human into a box.
But also, do you find in education too, Mon, I've been doing a lot lately on trying to, I don't feel as I do it that well all the time. Maybe because of that reflection, I'm being more confident with being unconfident. Teaching the difference between an acute and chronic wound. Chronic being, it's not so prickly for us. We know that's a poor term anyway. But at what point is something a chronic wound right from the start?
I think the way I teach it sometimes, and because I also want to talk a little bit, just go back when we've got a bit of time to talk about skin tears, the International Skin Tear Advisory Panel, talking about the difference between simple and complex, and maybe we can just park that there for a moment.
Revisit that one.
What was the last question you asked? Because now,
so the challenges in teaching between acute and chronic, and I'll often relate that to the stages of wound healing. But what I'm finding is particularly the types of wounds that we're focusing on, those hard to heal wounds, identifying when they're falling off that normal healing trajectory that we will associate with an acute wound. They're a chronic wound by that type of definition, right initially.
Yeah.
I often think of pressure injuries. They don't start with a bleeding event with hemostasis. So they didn't start as an acute wound.
And I think that's why I like this terminology, hard to heal.
100%.
And so even, this is the other thing, the other challenge I have, and I think it's starting to resonate across the space that I work in, is the understanding that if you've got a surgical wound, if that starts dehiscing superficially and starts to ooze, that's not following an expected trajectory of healing.
Not at all.
That in itself is now what I think is going to be a hard-to-heal wound.
Yep.
And so going back to skin tears, and probably I can segue into that
do that. Yep.
is so the International Skin Tear Advisory Panel, just type it into Google, it comes up, they've done it really quite nicely. I mean, they've put it into a box, but I think it gives people some context and somewhere to work through. So a skin tear that heals within 4 weeks is classified as a simple skin tear. One that doesn't look like it'll be healing within 4 weeks is classified as a complex skin tear. And so it really then forces you to or encourages, whatever word we want to use, to look at why. Yeah, we know that they may have knocked their leg against the walking frame or hit it on the door outside or whatever. The dog, bumped into them, not rubbed into them. And we know that happened. But further to your earlier point, the moment we recognise that really that's not the etiology, that's the mechanism of injury. And again, what's mechanism of injury? You can get a bunch of us in a room, experts, and we can debate that.
We can debate it, yep.
So what is now stopping that wound from healing? Where do we now prioritise that on our wound management charts? You've really, that's another light bulb for me. It's just an assumption we make.
Look, it's been highlighted a lot for me because I guess, and I have always had an association with working in residential aged care. I'm doing a lot more of that lately. I have a number of different areas I work in, but I'm finding that more challenging when I'm asked to do education and I have all of these facilities who are using charts that are part of their EMR. Even some of the ones I would say are the better ones, they are so limited in the fields that they allow you to fill in.
Yeah.
They might be a nice, easy, simple chart, but that's probably a nice, easy for a simple wound. They're not for these really hard to heal wounds. There's more of them out there. And how do we teach that when our documentation doesn't support best practice?
Yeah, any software developers out there, any hardware developers, I don't think I've yet found the quintessential product.
Is there one? That's what I'm coming to
Realise. Yeah.
Is there one? I am often, a lot of my followers on TikTok, well, what's the best wound chart? Have I actually seen one? I think it's often very contextual, the setting and the skill level and protocols. So many questions that come into it. But have I ever seen a group of wound colleagues like ourselves agree on the perfect chart?
No. Yeah, but then, yeah. And people will say, oh, well, it's not for our organisation. Our organisation's different. Or I think there's context. But sometimes I always say, well, the wound that started in an acute sector doesn't say, oh, I've got to change now because I'm now in the home. Like we almost...
don't get me started on going between sectors.
Yeah, that's another topic.
That's a completely
another topic.
Let's do that for sure. Yes, we've got lots of topics.
Yeah. So going back, maybe bringing it back to the skin tear is what's stopping that wound from healing. And we don't have the mechanisms or the tools available in the workforce.
We don't. I get frustrated. I'm going to be prickly, and I know I've been prickly in previous jobs I've been in where I've said I'm not going to teach that because our systems don't support it.
Yeah. Or I'm asked to provide education and service, and I'm saying, but do you have those tools available? Otherwise, I can come in.
It's tick box ticking.
Yep.
Sorry.
I can come in and educate, and manager, you'll look good because you've had 100% of your staff attend wound management education, but there's no resources, there are no tools for debridement.
And that's going to come through when they're filling in their evaluations. They're going to be poor education because we can't do it. Who does that reflect badly on?
Yeah.
But we educated them. I know I'm being a bit controversial.
And again, I think at our level, if we're escalating issues around, particularly in that clinical governance setting, often the answer to the world's problems, the panacea, is just do some education. Don't you just educate them? And that's so hard. That puts a lot of stress on the people either wanting or not wanting to do the education, but probably having to do the education because wounded people are everywhere. And then the middle managers look great because they've ticked their box, and yet the decision makers are being told your pressure injury rate's too high. Just this cyclic thing.
It's very cyclic. And if we're talking about the true costs of wounds, and we were talking about this in preparation as well, in some of those revised figures around what it costs. Is it 6.6 billion in Australia? And not often in the community sectors anyway. To change some of these systems, going back to that, what it would cost to change these systems. Often that's the kickback I've had before. Well, it costs more money for us to have that other system, or we're not able to change it. It really comes down to the financials, which is, time and the product cost as well to reformulate those systems that would support better practice. Those costs aren't factored into the actual costs of wound care. Those are extra costs. But we're happy to put up with chronic wounds costing this amount, and we're supposed to be raising awareness, but I really feel a lot of our awareness is in the wrong places.
Oh,
there we go.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to finish.
I think it's a great because we could probably keep talking, and this is the point where we'll call it.
Yeah.
For sure. There's a lot to think about, and I'll certainly reflect on some of that as well.
And, I think will give us an opportunity to reflect on what we've discussed for future topics.
And we will talk about all those aetiologies and mechanisms of injury. We will, we've got a whole host of topics planned to talk about. It's a good runner into it.
And for people who are emerging clinicians in wound management or advanced practice clinicians, nurse practitioners as well, I think hopefully we'll be able to provoke thinking again about the assumptions that even as advanced practice clinicians we make. And when you start hearing about some of my clinical insecurities, and I mean, I'm, again, mid-level. As I said, I'm not a nurse practitioner, But my middle level insecurities, hopefully it'll build the unconfidence in people, or the confidence in people to be unconfident. See, even I've got that all stuffed up. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That's just very real. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, all right. Till
We'll
next time.
Episode 3 then. Thanks, fellow echidnas.
From the two echidnae.
We are so grateful to have this opportunity to share our learnings and challenges with you today. Hopefully it has inspired you to be more curious in your clinical practice and burrow down to issues that bug you. If you liked today's episode, follow and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok at 2echidnae.
If we were too prickly, we'd also like to know. All our contact details and links we've mentioned are in the show notes below. You can also help us by leaving a review and sharing this with your colleagues. We will see you in the next episode, and in the meantime, go forth, be curious, and burrow into some ant nests.
There'll be struggles,